Hi everybody, it's Professor Snart here checking in. It's Friday morning, it's about 8 in the morning. I came in super early to work today, for me at least. Mostly because there's been such a strange week with the weather and the cancellations and, school cancellations now affect my daughter who's in 4th grade, so it's like kind of ideal when both schools get canceled, but sometimes they don't. Anyway, strange week. But doubly odd maybe because it doesn't really affect our class, so I keep thinking that it does or we're behind, but we're actually not. So anyway, checking in here for Unit 3. So where are we at with our due dates? It's probably messed with a lot of people's schedules though, because obviously you've had some classes canceled, probably some not. Depending on what day of the week your classes meet, like I have a Tuesday, Thursday that I teach face-to-face that minimally affected. I think we lost one day. But then I have a Monday, Wednesday class that because of the way the term started on the Wednesday, our first kind of whole week, like that Wednesday was like just getting started, that first class kind of a deal. And then we missed the Monday, and then we missed the Wednesday, so it feels really, really thrown off. Anyway, lots of different versions of having class disrupted that I'm going through. Maybe that's what makes it doubly confusing. I even got to the point this past week where I kind of forgot what day it was. I know that sounds bad, but just like none of the regular patterns were in place. Okay, speaking of patterns, let's take a look at where we're at. We have just wrapped up this due date for Unit 2. Obviously, we have our reply due date kind of sticking out here for Sunday. So I'm expecting people will get into the habit of kind of jumping ahead to the next unit while we wrap things up for that last one. So we're still with our short fiction piece of our Intro to Lit class, so short stories. We kind of looked at fiction structure here, or what we might call like plot, kind of what is happening when. This is also referred to as like the narrative arc of a story. And again, we looked at that Freytag's pyramid idea, where you have these certain pieces in place that follow sequentially from each other. And in theory, they make this nice little symmetrical visual diagram we can look at where we have some exposition, right? That's sort of like setting the scene. Where are we? Who are the characters? What's some of the basic information that our reader needs to know? Then we have the rising action where things are actually happening. We sense some conflict looming in the distance, or something like important is gonna unfold. Then we have the apex of the pyramid, that climax point where things really are their most intense. And remember, that's kind of like a relative measure. It doesn't mean that every short story has to have somebody die or something blow up or the zombies attack. Like, just because it's the most sort of intense moment in the story, it's all relative to what's happened before or what comes after it, right? In fact, some of the best stories have what seem like very everyday, kind of, I don't want to say boring, but, not like hyperbolic or over the top kinds of rising action and then that moment of conflict. And that's what makes them most interesting and the most difficult to write, honestly, is that you don't, as the writer, default to some like super grandiose over the top thing where there's a big explosion or all the people die, or it's really like just this like super dramatic kind of a thing. And then we have the notion of falling action, sort of like what follows from this moment of intense conflict. And then that denouement part, what would be Act 5 if we were looking at it in a play, sort of like the what happens in the weeks and years afterwards, right? Sometimes you get sort of like the moral of the story there, especially in older literature where they did a lot of that. Pardon me, but not so much in modern fiction. But the point, right, is that that's the theory. And in practice, as we'll see even in the stories that we read for Unit 3, the pieces are there, but they've been manipulated by each author in different ways, and that's what makes stories like interesting to read. Sometimes we get very little exposition, in which case, and I should have done this, but I'm just going to jump in. Remember what we'd want to do then, see this exposition line, it sort of takes up the whole word. If we feel like a story really has hardly any exposition, we're just like dropped into the middle of the scene and we almost have to figure out what's going on. Oftentimes, really good sci-fi or what's called speculative fiction works this way, where we're in a completely different sort of like universe, world or whatever, it might be sort of recognizable, but we know that things are not just our everyday normal world that we're used to. Sometimes there's very little exposition. In fact, if there's too much, it's usually bad science fiction because it sounds like a big encyclopedia entry that we're reading. So if we were to draw that, though, we wouldn't have this line that runs as the length of the whole word. We might just have a tiny little piece of it. And then we have to figure out, okay, does the action then rise really slowly, in which case the kind of angle of this rising action line changes. So we have this tiny little exposition bit, if any, almost like a dot, right? Maybe really quick rising action, and then everything is sort of falling action afterwards, like we have this major thing that happens at the start of the story, and then the rest of it is sort of like fallout, like how do people react, how do they cope, how do they recover, etc., etc. Or we might have this very slow rising action where we almost don't even know like what the point is or what the problem is or what is going to come around the corner, and then it's right upon us and we have this really steep, like almost vertical up and down line falling action, and then the denouement. Again, it can take a while, but in modern fiction, because we don't tend to get a lot of that moralizing or 3 years later they were still friends, whatever it happens to be. Again, the line in the theory takes up the whole word, but you could imagine it just being this little blip where the T is, for example. It still functions in the story that way, but we sort of draw it to reflect what's actually going on in the story. So again, the point that you need to be aware of is that the apex of the triangle here appears right symmetrically in the middle in the theory, as if you had a 10-page story on page like 5.5 or 5-ish, you would have that moment of conflict right perfectly symmetrically between each of the other parts that are themselves equal, like the exposition is exactly as long as the denouement, the rising action is exactly as long as the falling action, etc., etc. But of course, what we see when we actually read the stories and try to map them out is that apex really almost always does not fall in the exact middle. So if we were to draw it, we need to shift it, usually to the right, because that's more how modern fiction works, but sometimes to the left, where we just have that moment right at the start, and then everything follows from that. So again, when you represent these visually, don't just redraw the symmetrical pyramid and either label a whole bunch of stuff at the start or at the end to reflect kind of the differences in the story. The visual pyramid should be, or triangle, should be different as well. So that's kind of what we're taking away from Unit 2 with our focus on really like plot. We get into conflict because obviously you have to think about like where that actually occurs. Theme is almost implied throughout. We're almost always reading for theme. As we get into Unit 3 then, we're really looking at character and setting. Let me find my way back here. So we're piecing these things out sort of for the purpose of our course, like for analysis. But obviously when we read fiction, and certainly when you write it, if you ever do any creative writing, you don't really think about these things as completely separate. It's important to have the vocabulary and that sort of knowledge in the background, but it's not like we could ever really separate, say, setting from plot or character from plot. Like that would be almost impossible, right? So it's just sort of artificial the way that we treat them here, again, sort of for the purposes of our class. All right, so a couple more stories to read here. I personally find them all really interesting. You'll find some similar themes going on, but lots of differences, again, in the way that authors explore those themes or sort of portray them through their character, the narrative arc of the story. None of them are overly long, but they will take you a little while to read. Cathedral, I think, is maybe the longest. Araby is probably the shortest, but I would say it's also the most challenging. So James Joyce, a famous Irish author. I remember the first time I read Araby, it was in like a printed textbook. And so I got to the bottom of the page, and I turned the page, and there was no more story. And I obviously didn't understand what was going on, because I could have sworn, like, there must be more to this story. Like, what just happened here? Why is this even a story? I had this moment where I thought my textbook had dropped pages or was misprinted or misbound somehow. Fast forward, right, years from that initial reading, and I find myself applying for the job that I have now. This is a decade ago. Actually tasked to do the teaching demo, which is part of the application process, to teach Araby. So it came back to me there. And I had been studying it and reading it, so I had a much better grasp, thank goodness. but I did tell the same joke because I think a lot of people read that story and they get to the end and it's like, what the, what? Where's the story? But it is actually really sophisticated. And in fact, it's Joyce's, famous in some ways for the way he manipulates very real world, just sort of everyday events and details, puts them together in such a way that we almost don't sense like a story is even happening. Like we're left wondering what just occurred. And yet, if we go back, which is obviously what I would encourage you to do, we begin to see all of these really subtle patterns and nuances and uses of language that if you're just sort of reading for plot, like what happens, you're going to miss the first time. So Araby is very short. No, your textbook is not misprinted, or no, your browser didn't have an error. That is actually where and the way the story ends. But it's a really, really sophisticated short story. So anyway, we are going to treat these three stories in terms of their setting and their character. And I'm going to actually jump down to the character assignment because it's a little more, I guess, straightforward. So we're going to build out our portfolios again. We're into Unit 3 here, character comparison. You can probably guess what we're doing, a character comparison. Choose two stories from the ones that we've read for this unit, so we want to focus on these three. They should be from different stories. And then you want to build out your website, or it could be a page, could be a couple pages, however you want to organize it, that compares them. And again, we want to see similarities, not really differences. We already know that on the surface they're different, so you don't need to tell us that. And you don't really need to feel like you're writing just an essay on the web. Try to really use the web and the way that you can build in video or audio or images or even hyperlinks between different things to really communicate your comparison. Don't just make it one block of text as if you just, again, like wrote an essay on the web. As always, make sure you're quoting directly from the stories to really support your points. We're not too concerned with like MLA citation and a work cited, etc., etc. Those are important in maybe more formal research situations, but we're really more focused on the content here. So let that be your focus. You can like cite a page number or whatever, but it doesn't need to be all perfect and all that kind of jazz. Once you're finished, be sure to publish so your website is updated. Post your link to the discussion board up here, and then read and reply to 4 of your classmates' pages, or you can read as many as you like. But at least reply to, using the discussion board, at least 4. Again, it might seem like a lot, but I feel like this is one of the major ways that we interact with each other, so it's good to do more than just a couple per unit. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward, like it has that sort of tech component, but a kind of assignment that you're probably familiar with in terms of studying literature or even doing other kinds of things where you're just making that comparison. Focusing on similarities rather than difference is the one thing that I would really highlight. Okay, so let's go up to our setting assignment. And this is one that I really want you to kind of sit with for a minute here and understand that it unfolds very differently, I hope, than other assignments that you might do. So the character comparison, you're probably going to sit down and do in 1 or 2 like sittings or sessions. You're just at your computer, you've got your text open or you've got the stories open so you can quote. Maybe you make some notes for some ideas and then you just go ahead and build it and post it and it's done. I'm not saying to do it quickly or that it doesn't take time, but it's one of those traditional, you're at your computer, your desk, right, doing the work. The setting one is very different. It's meant to be a mobile assignment. In fact, you're supposed to use your smartphone here. We're going to use a tool that I really like called Padlet, and it looks like this, but that's not where you're going to do it. It's just blank right now, but you'll understand why. So it's like a virtual or digital corkboard, stuff that you can pin something to, and that's how we're going to use it. So you're going to want to go just use your browser or your smartphone's browser, like Chrome or whatever the iOS one is. I don't know if is it Safari on a smartphone? I don't even know. Anyway, there's no app to download. You don't have to sign up for an account. You can do all that stuff, but you don't have to. So it's really sort of streamlined. There's no extra things that you need to do. You're just visiting this URL on your smartphone, and it'll pull up this like blank corkboard, or if people have already posted, you'll begin to see the things that people have posted. So what I want you to do is, unlike the assignment where you just sit and do it at your computer, do this one in a truly like mobile fashion. So what we're doing is kind of looking for settings that you run into in your everyday real life. You're not searching the web, you're not pulling from past vacation photos or something like that. You're looking for pictures that evoke a setting that you think is similar to the ones, or that evoke the same mood as the ones that we find in either Cathedral, The Lesson, or Araby. You can use any one of those or a mix of them. So you're not Googling something, you're not pulling stock photos, you're not pulling photos from your trip to New York, which is like where the lesson occurs, or any of that stuff. It's meant to be you're like producing an image from your everyday life that just sort of happens, that reminds you of or evokes some sensibility that's the same as the story. So you see how that's like totally different? It's sort of like an ongoing, ubiquitous type of thing. In fact, one of the other terms that's often used for mobile learning is ubiquitous learning, like it's happening all the time, everywhere. It sounds tiring, but it's actually really not. It's I think, a way more interesting way to learn or to sort of practice knowledge. And it'll feel very different than that, sitting at the computer doing that kind of assignment. So what you want to do then, once you've pulled up this browser, or this link on your browser, if you run into like a setting, you're just looking out the window, or you're traveling from one place to another, or you're doing something, or whatever, like just your normal everyday life, you'll be able to either click the little icon. I think you can even just double tap right on the blank space somewhere, and it will let you like upload a photo or even do a video right then and there. And you can add a little bit of text, but you don't really have to add tons of text. This is more of a visual assignment. The only text that we need for sure is your name, because you're not signing in like with an account name or anything like that. So I need your name to know whose picture is whose. I want you to post at least 3 pictures. Again, it's better if they're not all from the same story. You're not finding an image on the web. You're not pulling from old photos, even if they happen to be yours. This should be happening like in real time as you live your life for the next week or week and a half. Have this on your phone, just sort of sitting in the background so you can pull it up. And the great thing is, from my perspective, maybe not from yours, is that to do this effectively, you almost always have to be a little bit conscious of, these are the stories I read, this is what I think about them, or this is sort of like what the setting evoked for me, and now I have to keep my eye out kind of in your everyday life for a picture, an image, like a space that evokes the same thing. And again, it's not literal. We're not taking pictures of Dublin, of New York, of the New England countryside or whatever. We have to do it sort of from our local context. So just evoking sort of metaphorically that same mood that you feel emerges. You can explain that a little bit then when you post your picture, but again, just make sure you have your name attached to it. That's the main thing. We'll actually be using these in our next unit as well. So again, we're not necessarily done with them here as a one-off thing. We'll be returning to them. Okay, so quick look at our due dates again, just as a reminder. Finishing up here, replies, moving into our character and setting. So we have our character comparison and also the Padlet assignment that I just described, looking towards next week. It's supposed to be like 50 on Monday. Crazy. Replies, right, next unit, etc., etc. And then we kind of wrap up with our short fiction group project. If you want to, you could probably look at that now just to get a sense of how that's going to work. But again, that's looking a few weeks in advance. Okay, so if you have any questions or issues or whatever coming up, by all means let me know, and I will check in with everybody next week when it's, again, 50 and raining, or 20 and I don't even know. Who knows? Get your shorts out.